Senator Bayh. I originally started this paper as a paper on amendments, and then realized the key role Senator Bayh was playing in these things. So I sort of modified it a little bit to be focused on Senator Birch Bayh. Some of you may, if you don't remember Senator Bayh, you may have heard his son has been in the news in the last 5-10 years, Evan Bayh of Indian Hills. In fact, he was spoken of as a presidential candidate. I want to begin by mentioning a psychologist, Maria Konnikova, because Bayh has a very interesting story about how Bayh came about being involved in the 25th Amendment, which is the primary focus of what I looked at. And Konnikova wrote a sort of a popular book. The title was How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. Doesn't sound serious, but she's a PhD from Columbia University, so she's a serious academic, and wrote a very fine book, so I highly recommend it. But in the book, she says that there have been studies that show there are instances that sort of stimulate thinking, to get people to thinking about things that they wouldn't ordinarily do that. She mentions sometimes while showering, people will think through problems. She mentions sometimes just before falling asleep, they'll have a Eureka moment. And so Bayh was a senator from Indiana, and the connection here is he was on a plane flying back for campaign from D.C. to Indiana, and he had there on the plane a legal pad on the armrest, and he was thinking about things, and he started scribbling on the legal pad. He'd been thinking for a while about the Kennedy assassination, presidential succession, and those kinds of things. And that scribble on the pad literally became the 25th Amendment. Very few words changed. He took that and showed it to certain individuals in the Senate, and that's how we got the 25th Amendment. I'll give you a few more details as we go through this. But you've all heard lately of the Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate. The Judiciary Committee has a subcommittee on constitutional amendments, and that committee's been around for decades. In the 1950s, when the chairman of that subcommittee died unexpectedly, the chairman of the committee was going to kill the subcommittee. And Senator Bayh at that time was a junior, hadn't been in the Senate very long. And he went to the chairman and said, I'm really interested in this subject, and I don't think we should kill this subcommittee. And I, for one, would volunteer, if you'll keep it alive, to head it up. And so the chairman did keep it. We still have it today. He went on to chair that committee, and of course played a key role in not only producing the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1960, proposed 65, ratified in 67, but he got the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18. That also, he spearheaded the movement on that as chairman of that subcommittee, and almost pulled off the hat trick and almost got the 27th Amendment, which was the ERA in the late 70s. And he did get that one proposed. He came, as you probably know, 3 states short of ratification. But had he done that, it would have been incredible. Even with the 2 that he had, he now has the distinction, along with Matt Kennedy, of course, was assassinated in late November of '63. As the nation mourned his incredible assassination, with a thoughtless act of almost a random act of violence. Man in his prime, at a young age, with a beautiful family, and probably a great career, shot down. Bayh was thinking of what he needed to do. He felt like there was something he needed to do. And as I said, it was on that plane ride that he came up with this idea of amending the Constitution. Now, I won't go into the details because you probably know them, but amending, there's a whole article in our Constitution devoted to amending Article 5. And it is somewhat of a convoluted, worded in a convoluted way. In fact, Alabama used to use it as a device to keep African Americans from voting. They'd say, read that and tell me what it means. And it's very hard for anyone to read it cold and make sense of it. That's because, for one thing, when you break it down, it actually describes 4 different permutations about how the Constitution can be amended. 2 ways to propose, 2 ways to ratify, which leads to 4 permutations, only 2 of which we've ever been used. But amending has been used, a lot of times people don't think of categorizing our amendments, but if you think about it, amendments have been used primarily, with rare exception, to correct technical flaws, things the framers didn't exactly elaborate on or make clear. I think the 25th Amendment would fit in that category of vice presidential issues and presidential succession and disability. Framers mentioned inability in Article 2, but they don't elaborate. So you have those kinds of amendments. And then you have amendments, and this is the one I find that people know the least. You've probably heard the Supreme Court criticized for, here are these men now and women, thankfully, that decide what our Constitution means, and we don't get to vote for them, and they're nameless, faceless. They say Chief Justice Rehnquist, who had a bad back, used to get up from his desk to stretch his back and go outside and walk around the block. And I think he admitted once, he was on the court for 34 years. I think he admitted not once walking around the block did anyone say, "Are you Chief Justice Rehnquist?" It never happened. So we don't know who they are, we don't vote for them, we couldn't name all of them. And yet they have the final say in what our framing document means. But they don't. We have the final say through amending. And 5 times we've used amendments to overrule Supreme Court decisions, which is our way of saying we don't like the court decision and we're going to change it now permanently. So that's the second category, I'd say, of amendments. 20% of amendments have been used for that. And then most of the amendments, including the other one, Bayh, pretty much authored and led through the Congress, the Senate particularly, are those amendments that expand individual rights. Well, the 25th Amendment, of course, it's been in the news lately because of Mr. Trump, and it's one of most amendments are rather brief, but a few of them are lengthy, and the 25th Amendment is one of the lengthier ones, not quite as lengthy as the 12th and the 14th, but lengthy compared to the others. It has 4 sections to it. Section 1 is kind of interesting. If you haven't looked at it lately, it stipulates that when there's a death, removal, or resignation of a president, that the vice president will become president. Now, an interesting question. That was at 1967. So the question becomes, didn't we know that a long time ago? And the answer is we did. But, so why is that in there? Well, again, Bayh, give credit to Bayh. Bayh knew the history here. And of course, the Constitution, again mentioning this, says that in case of the removal of the president, I'm quoting now, in case of the removal of the president or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. So that's in there. So the first vice president to have to, the first time our nation interpreted that was with Tyler. Remember Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Harrison, Tyler. So Harrison dies 1 month into office, remember that story. Tyler then is in. The first bill that the Congress sent over to Tyler for his signature, body of the bill, the bottom, a line, were for Tyler to sign if he wants to sign it. And under the line was the title acting president. Tyler took his pen, marked out acting, and then signed the bill and proceeded to inform Congress he was president. So what he did in essence was interpret what I just read. Something the framers said was devolving on the vice president. Was it the office or the powers and duties? You might say, who cares? But it mattered, because if you say it's the office, then you have a president. You don't need a special election to replace your other president. And the vice president, Tyler's right, is not just acting. He's ensconced in the office. If he's acting, then you can arrange for a special election. And to people, this was particularly important in this instance because Harrison had only been president 1 month. And so here was a man that was elected to another office, now serving out literally a full term. Well, anyway, this became known as Tyler's precedent. And what Bayh found out in researching to write the 25th Amendment is that probably Tyler got it wrong. There's evidence that the framers in the first Congress talked about having special elections, and there's some evidence that they thought vice presidents who succeeded would be mere actors instead of becoming president. So in any event, Bayh didn't change the situation, but he thought this would clear it up. This would make it constitutional, definitive. There'd be no question later about it. Section 2, well, let me mention section 3 and 4 quickly. 3 and 4 deal with presidential disability, or as the framers called it, inability. They're using these interchangeably, those words, in talking about these subjects. But 3, Bayh said, okay, what if a president knows he's going to be disabled, like he knows he's going to have an operation, or what'll be the procedures for declaring himself disabled, so he could put in writing, I'm going to have surgery from 7 a.m. on one day when I'm going to be under the control of the surgeon until I wake up and sign a paper. The vice president will serve as acting president. That way there's no question of the vice president becoming president. One of the, by the way, another reason it was another byproduct of having these the Tyler precedent for, and remember we had it for a long time, was that vice presidents tended to stay away when we needed them. As Garfield lay dying for 80-some days, Arthur didn't speak to him once. And why? The fear was, or be president once, trying to be do anything presidential. Why? Because if he exercised the powers and duties under Tyler's president, he became president. And then if Garfield recovers, you have 2 presidents and a constitutional crisis. So wives would take over, or aides would take over. And this was not good, Bayh thought. We need to get all this settled. So section 3 does that with disability. Section 4 it addresses what if a president is ill and doesn't know it. I think you know what I mean.
We all do.
And so you have the ability of a pretty convoluted procedure for handling that. Now, when Bayh wrote that down on the legal pad, the first person he showed it to was Sam Ervin. Remember him from the Watergate era? Sam Ervin was kind of a constitutional scholar. He'd been in the Senate, so Bayh wanted to get his co-sponsorship, knowing if I get him on board, because let's face it, amendments are pretty rare. You know, I'm from Oklahoma. My state came in the early 1900s. We've amended our Constitution already over 150 times. The U.S. Constitution from 1787 has been amended 27 times. 10 came all at once, and one cancels another one. So if you want to do fuzzy math, you got 16 formal changes. So anyway, he shows it to Sam Ervin. Ervin looks over and goes, "This is fantastic. It's incredible. You've done it." And so Bayh says, "So you'll co-sponsor?" He goes, "No, I'm not going to go for this." He goes, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You use the word cabinet. You say the vice president and the cabinet can declare a president disabled. I'm not going to vote for something that uses the word cabinet. It's not in the Constitution, and I'm not going to put it in there." So Bayh said, "Well, what if I change it to heads of the executive departments?" He said, "What do you mean? The cabinet?" And he goes, "Well, how will you guarantee that?" He goes, "I'll go to every subcommittee and committee hearing. I'll plant someone that'll answer questions from the members of Congress, and we'll plant the question every time, so it'll be in the legislative history. We'll say, what do you mean by heads of the executive department? The cabinet. But it won't be in there." And so we got the support, and of course we got the amendment. Section 2 of the amendment is how to fill vice presidential vacancies. When Bayh's writing this on the legal pad, we'd had about 35 years of vice presidential vacancy. There was no way to fill a vice presidential vacancy. So when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson assumed the presidency, no vice president. When Kennedy was assassinated, of course this was on Bayh's mind, Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson, remember that classic scene of him taking the oath on the airplane in Dallas, became president. No vice president. And this is the nuclear age. This is Bayh's world. We're in the nuclear age, things move fast, and we've already had 30-some years of vacancy. We should not have uncertainty of who's going to take over in the event of. So that was his section 2, and that was the one that, all of these provisions except section 4 have been used, the one on a president being declared disabled. But section 2 became somewhat controversial because in 73, you had the President Nixon and Agnew were reelected in 72, right? In 73, fall of 73, Agnew resigned, pled no little contendere, and plea bargained and resigned from the vice presidency. And so Gerald Ford became the first appointed vice president. And that went pretty smoothly. I'll point out a problem with the process in a moment, but that went pretty smoothly. But then Nixon resigned. Ford succeeds to the presidency. Now he appoints the second vice president in our history, Nelson Rockefeller, and that goes pretty smoothly. And then you have, but the problem is in 1976, the year of our bicentennial, which we're celebrating the great experiment of democracy, the greatest democracy on the planet, we have a president and a vice president, neither of which have been elected, both have been appointed to office. And I can tell you, having read all the hearings, Bayh and his cohorts did not see that one coming. But the problems with, the potential problems, we haven't seen these problems, because those are the only 2 instances we've seen, filling vice presidential vacancies. The potential problem was highlighted by the Merrick Garland case, frankly. Because, the Constitution tells how we fill vacancies on the Supreme Court. But little did we know, a single man in the Senate could delay it for a year. Well, they didn't, I know this since I've read the hearings. One of the things that Bayh and his cohorts were concerned with, when we're going to place time limits on these things. If you have a vacancy in the vice presidency, should we say the president should appoint within a month? Should name someone within a month, a week, 6 months? Should we go there? And they almost did, but in the end they didn't. So there's no time constraints on that. So if you have a weird person in office that wants to delay it, you can still get a constitutional crisis pretty easily on your hands. One of the things, finally on the 25th Amendment, one of the things that it did, by the way, was probably even though, you might find this interesting, we've had 3 laws dealing with double vacancies, 1792, 1886, and the latest, if you teach American government, 1947. Well, I've got baby time?
It's 7 minutes.
Okay, cool. Well, the 26th Amendment, now on that one, the chanting in the, this era, which is again, late 60s, early 70s, the chanting is, the young people are chanting, I put it this way, bullets versus ballots, using the alliterative effect there, bullets versus ballots. What happened was, we're in the Vietnam War, and we have a lottery in 1969. And suddenly young men between the ages 18, 19, and 20 are being drafted and sent to Vietnam, and of course there's a wall now. You know how sad that wall is. I go by there and touch 2 names every summer. But these were men who could not vote for president. Some of them. Well, all of them, 18, 19, 20. Now there were about 9 out of the 50 states at that time that allowed younger people to vote. But 41 states said you have to be 21. And Congress tried to lower the voting age to 18. They did it in a federal law, and the prime example of what I mentioned earlier, Oregon versus Mitchell, the Supreme Court struck the law down. You can't lower the voting age. And we the people spoke and said, through the help of Birch Bayh, we're going to now. And he introduced the amendment to lower the voting age. The average to 18 nationwide, the average length of time for ratifying a proposed amendment to the Constitution is 2.5 years. It took 2 months to get the 26th Amendment approved. When people realized that we were drafting young men to fight for our country, and yet they had no say in who was going to be president, that was a no-brainer. They needed to have the right to vote. And so very quickly, we got the 26th Amendment. The 27th Amendment, or what almost became the 27th Amendment, of course, the great story behind the 27th Amendment, which was proposed by the first Congress and ratified in 1992, but what almost became the 27th Amendment was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Once again, Birch Bayh, on his little subcommittee on constitutional amendments, proposed a 23-worded amendment, equal rights, no law shall deny equal rights among the sex, based on sex. There's 4 words etched in stone above the Supreme Court building: equal justice under law. And this was a way in the early 70s to announce it's time that the law treat men and women equally. That was proposed. There was a rush to ratify. Of course, as you know, Congress always places a 7-year clause on these things now, saying if they're not ratified within 7 years, they're no longer proposed. That didn't apply to the amendment that's now the 27th, ironically. But then we heard that if you applied the logic of Brown versus Board of Education to the language of this amendment that Bayh and others had proposed, we would have sexually integrated restrooms, which we kind of have today, but our worlds haven't fallen apart. But anyway, so there was a big, not only did that halt the rush to ratify, but 3 states, Idaho, Nebraska, and Tennessee, rescinded their votes. So when you read a history book, 35 states, we came close, 38, 3/4 of 50. When you read in a history book, well, we got to 35, well, that's counting the 3 that took their vote back. But we don't know. There's never been a Supreme Court decision saying if you can do that. I mean, obviously you can do it. They did it. We don't know if it's authorized. But they extended the deadline 3 years, hoping to get 1 even stated year. They didn't get another state. And the amendment died. Although, if you go on the web, go to the internet, there's a movement now. I forget which state just recently ratified it. They're going to use the logic of what is now the 27th Amendment to say, well, they extended the deadline, but they didn't. When the amendment was proposed, something dicey about it didn't have the limit. Well, it was in the enabling resolution rather than in the amendment. Yeah, if you read some of these amendments, it's actually in there. This amendment will expire with it. But with this one, they just put it in the, whereas, and then left it out, so it's not in it, you'll see it. So the argument now is, well, it wasn't in there, well, it wasn't in the second proposed amendment, which became our 27th. Kind of confusing, isn't it? But I'll hope to clear that up if you have any questions. But anyway, the ERA went down to defeat, and Bayh didn't get the hat trick. But I still think Senator Bayh, we deserve to honor him for, this was a man who worked long and hard on two what have become very important amendments. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes before lunch. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that you may have of our presenters. Yes.
Lee, you mentioned two groups, and I want to suggest there were three groups. And I'm thinking of the Alice Paul group, weren't part of the, if you will, progressive movement, but really were the Equal Rights Amendment, if you will.
Alice Paul, yes, that's right.
With women's groups. So I would say there were three different groups.
The temperance, the
And
suffrage.
ironically, it was only the last Alice Paul's group that really was pro-civil rights for African Americans.
Yeah.
The others didn't. Women started off being so upset, in fact, that black males had the right to vote if they didn't.
Yeah.
That they actually argued against expanding,
They were guilty of racism by
Yeah,
those people that were temperance people.
Yes, yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Professor Adkison about the relationship between a previous constitutional crisis and Senator Bayh, if he thought about it at all. In 1876, the Hayes-Tilden disputed election led to a great deal of talk about a possible second Civil War.
Yeah.
Did Senator Bayh think at all about the problems of an electoral college in a modern era when we tell the whole world about our democracy?
That's true, yeah. Yes, he did. He actually he was for modifying the Electoral College. And, of course, there's been more proposals to, of all things, to amend the Constitution. The one topic that's most often been done is the Electoral College. I think there have been over 10,000 bills introduced into Congress. But, I didn't look into that, but he was one of the forerunners of saying we need to change this thing. And at one point, got it before him as a vote to propose and thought they were going to have luck with it, but it didn't make it. The interests are so entrenched in the Electoral College. The big states like it, the small states like it, so who's not to like it? And so when he did try to get it changed.
I'm sorry, right behind you.
I was going to say, there's actually a national popular vote movement that would provide for an interstate compact that would have states cast all of their votes for the national popular vote winner. And if states with 270 electoral votes did that, of course, you would assure the popular vote doing it. About 165 votes have already been ratified in those states, and of course they're all Democratic states that are.
The problem is,
But
most of the states say they won't abide by it until
Right.
all the states do
Birch,
it.
that's correct. Birch Bayh and John Anderson were the primary authors of that movement.
Yeah,
So,
he was right there on it, yeah.
And that was because he realized you could not get an amendment, so he thought he could do it through the back door.
That's a very, very interesting,
Yeah.
creative constitutional thing.
Mr. Bailey, did you have a comment?
I seem to remember when I was in school growing up, they told us that even, because I'm old and about to die, even before the 25th Amendment, or 26th Amendment was passed, that there was a routine in place for succession beyond the vice president. And I remember Al Haig, when Reagan was shot, sort of rushing in and putting his foot in his mouth because he was Secretary of State.
Right. Yeah,
Somebody
I'm
had
in control here.
Yeah, somebody had to remind him that oldest rule of succession had changed.
Yes, that's for double vacancies.
So there was some sort of rule
Well,
of
it still is,
succession.
yeah, the 47 Presidential Succession Act.
Yeah.
Real quick, the 1792 law, written by the first Congress, said that the first in line would be the President Pro Tem of the Senate, and the second would be the Speaker. That was the end of it, but it also says you'll have special elections. I think there was a time period that if there's 2 or more years left, you hold a special election to replace them, actually vote someone in instead of waiting. That was changed when Benjamin Wade voted to impeach Johnson in the Senate because it looked unethical that he was voting to convict Johnson, which would have made him the successor. So there was the movement to change it, which they finally did during Garfield's assassination. They changed it to the cabinet, basically, without using the word. They said, well, that they should have executive officials in there. Truman didn't like that, an accidental president. So when Truman got in, Truman said, you shouldn't have someone who's never been elected, potentially, succeed to the presidency. So let's change it to the Speaker of the House, reverse that old order they had in the first Congress, change it to the Speaker, and then second, if he's not available or if he's ineligible, second, President Pro Tem, if he's ineligible, then go to the heads of executive departments with the oldest first state, and then going forward till you find someone eligible. Kissinger, for example, wouldn't have been eligible. Obama's Secretary of State, Margaret Madeline, she wouldn't have been eligible. But yeah, it's covered by that.
That brings up another, especially ironic today in other circumstances. When Agnew was forced to resign, that enabled a president for the first time to nominate a new vice president. President Nixon nominated a very popular Jerry Ford. Everybody liked him, decent guy, and so forth. But there was discussion among the Democrats who knew or who had a pretty good idea that Nixon wasn't going to finish out his term. And he did. A few months later, he was forced from office. And Carl Albert from your state was Speaker of the House and had they stonewalled it and not confirmed, and it takes both houses to confirm.
That's right, the only presidential appointment that does.
And if either the House or the Senate had not moved to confirm Jerry Ford, then when Nixon was forced from office, Carl Albert was president.
That's true.
The Democrats considered that and unanimously agreed, including Mr. Albert, that that would be dishonorable. You do not do that in American politics. The people voted for a Republican president, therefore they had the right to have a Republican president, so they confirmed Jerry Ford.
Where is that thinking now?
Well, it's certainly not among the Republicans.
Yeah, well, but I'll tell you something. I was in D.C. during that time, and I saw, not routinely, but periodically, Carl Albert, and he did not look well. He had, I'm sorry to say, a real drinking problem during that time, and every time I saw him, so I wonder if the Democrats, I mean, this is very informal talk here, but wondered, do we really want Mr. Albert succeeding, even if we could pull that off and were mean enough to try to do it? But when I would see him, I would think he did not look well at all during that time period. And maybe it was the pressure. That would have been a lot of pressure, because even if they didn't plan it, it still could happen. But yeah, that's a good point.
Can I ask a question about the union movement? It strikes me that one of the reasons for the demise of private unions, and I think you have to distinguish private versus public unions, they're entirely different in terms of their role in the economy. I think that part of the problem with private unions is that businesses have conspired to reduce the impact of unions in the United States, and have done so quite aggressively, including a number of states that have enacted right-to-work laws in recent years, and that the demise of the private union is heavily correlated with the disparity between rich and poor in the United States. So I think that there's a huge impact that the demise of the union movement has had on the economy, and I think it's had a very deleterious effect on workers in the United States. So while we can say that workers are better off now than they were a century ago, well, of course they are. They have electricity, they have air conditioning, they have cars that weren't available then. true. But I think relative to the management in large businesses, that labor is worse off now than it was a century ago. What's your opinion?
And wouldn't, just to add to that, the compulsory arbitration as a
Sure.
movement, which is.
Yeah, I mean, Taft-Hartley being the first shot into the Wagner Act, of course.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that sentiment, in the sense that the Taft-Hartley Act that you mentioned was probably the beginning, 1947, where the balance of power started to shift back. Now, management has always had some kind of say in the labor movement. For example, for a long time, they would have company unions. So they would actually create, have their own people form the unions. And in fact, in one of the hearings, they paid for the company union representatives to testify, and they were exposed for that, so to speak. And also, the Landrum-Griffith Act in 1959 also talked about, they reduced the power of the unions. They had them report to the government. They talked about excesses of unions and so on and so forth. So there has been a balance of power shift, and it's been continuously eroding. For example, recent Supreme Court decisions from 2018, where they said that you don't have the right to collect for collective arbitration, for example. That's a further erosion of the Union Act. They also said in another decision that you could not, for example, force people to pay a fee for a fair share fee, as they call it. So to that extent, yes, it has been steadily eroding. But let me give you another example. There was a hospital, Long Beach Memorial Hospital out of California, and they had people wear union, they said you could not wear a union button or badge when you're visiting patients. And the NLRB said that you can't force people to do that because they would be wearing the same badge in non-patient care areas, and you can't force it. So that was something in the favor of workers, but the important point there is that the right to form a union was never questioned. So that part is now part of the national consciousness and is an accepted thing. And while you're talking about the balance of power issues, in terms of actual working conditions, it is much, much better. In terms of discrimination, it is much, much better. If you're 40 years old and if you're fired, the Age Discrimination Act will protect you. If you're disabled and if you are not provided for, accommodated, you are protected. So from a political standpoint, perhaps yes, but from living condition and overall improvement, I would say that they are better off.
Anyone else? I think we're about ready. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I'm old. My grandfather.
That seems to be a theme.
And I think Lee probably beats you to it.
There you go, yes.
Well, there aren't many things I can contribute, but I have some memory of my grandfather who died at 97, but that was a long time ago because he was born in 1875. And he came to this country in 1892 and went to work as a cigar roller in Chicago. And he loved to tell me stories about that period. And one of the things he told me about was getting arrested as an anarchist. Now, an anarchist
force structures. And so it's very hard to put pressure on Walmart in Shreveport, Louisiana, right? And so I think, and so the employees who do not fare well are the ones who tend to be most closely aligned with those conglomerates and those larger companies. Yes?
One more. Let me do the other part of that story. I worked for IBM for 28 years. I have to tell you that they voted for unions every year, and they never got one. And the reason was that they had so many wonderful employee benefits that they just thought. One of the things they did, which was so interesting, is that a guy came to work in the factory. They gave him a set of tools to take home because they knew the guys stole tools. And they said, you're given these because we want you to improve your skills with these tools on your own projects. Interesting thing, but I don't think anybody could get a union in IBM. It was a wonderful company, and there were a lot of them like that. So unions have made the large corporations change tremendously.
At IBM, wouldn't that been because also if you went home and you invented something new, a product that they had first rights to it?
Well, that's every corporation, that's it.
Well, I mean, I would send somebody home with tools too, if they're gonna invent something new that I had the right to. Fair enough.
But it belonged to the company.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm gonna leave the last word to Dr. Menon, and then we're gonna excuse ourselves for lunch. Yes.
I wanted to show you an NRA poster. I know I have the attention of gun enthusiasts, but I'm sorry to disappoint you. What I'm going to show you is this. This is the National Recovery Administration. Okay, that's the NRA at that time. That was famous, and they would have this blue eagle posters on shop fronts and the businesses that followed the NIRA code. There was a peace treaty of sorts between industrialists, factory owners, and employees. Okay, so just thought I'd mention that. Thank you.
Thank you.